Hello, and welcome to the FI Entrepreneur, Financial Planning for the Risk Taker. This podcast will show you how to achieve FI through entrepreneurial pursuits by developing a well-calibrated and thought-out plan for risk management so that you can maximize the rewards.
Hosted by certified financial planner, enrolled agent, and serial entrepreneur Ben Martinek, this is the FI Entrepreneur, Financial Planning for the Risk Taker.
The information presented in this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. None of the content is presented as investment advice. Consult your financial professional before acting on any of the information presented in this show. Hi, everyone. This is the FI Entrepreneur with Ben Martinek and my lovely co-host,
Deb. I'm here too.
Hey, Deb. Good to have you. Thanks for being with me today. So our topic of interest or of focus is going to be on the question of financing your little venture. So we've been talking about entrepreneurship and trying to get something off the ground and how that's ultimately beneficial, we think, into the long term for many reasons, both wealth accumulation, retirement distribution planning. Ultimately, it's the FI Entrepreneur. This is about achieving financial independence. And even though entrepreneurship is certainly not an easy feat and it is time consuming and has its demands and stresses, we still are believing that ultimately you can achieve financial independence. But this cannot just achieve it, but this is actually a great way to achieve financial independence. But now we have a question of, okay, we've got a business or we've got at least an idea and maybe we want to get something going. Well, ideas need money usually, right? Businesses need money to run. So how do we get this business going? So we'll talk a little bit about our own story in this episode, but also some other conventional methodologies, considerations for you to have with having your own business. So with that thought, Deb, what do you think? What should someone do as they get a business off the ground? What did we do?
Yeah, just to talk about our experience. And we've mentioned this in previous podcast episodes as well, but Ben had this idea of starting his financial planning business, but in light of that, knew that he needed some additional education, and that education, while he was studying for it, was not going to provide sustenance or any income for us. And so we had the opportunity for him to drive a local truck driving route, which he had had experience in. Because if you remember, the first few years of our marriage were spent with the both of us driving semi-truck across the country to pay off our debt. So he used those skills that he had to be able to work and still provide an income, but that schedule allowed him to have several days during the week where he could just study. And so using that mode, if you will, as we continued on with Ben finishing his exams and getting his designations, he still wanted to get that learning experience through employment opportunities with a few different firms that he worked for. But we kept that income going with the truck driving until what he earned in the other opportunities was enough to replace that. And so it was this ongoing cycle of, okay, I got to work this so that I can have enough time or income to serve the needs of continuing my education until we were able to invert that a bit.
Yeah, that's right. We needed to ultimately save a little bit of money for seed capital for the venture. I think one of the bigger challenges, and I don't want to get too off topic here, but one of the bigger challenges of running a business is the replacement of your income coming home, because for most businesses, there's not a whole lot of income coming in immediately. So in our circumstance, that was certainly the case. It wasn't feasible for us to be shut down into a single income household and make that work. Now, you may be having the good fortune where perhaps your spouse does provide enough income into the home that if he or she, you don't only need to make any income or money off this venture right away, then it's not a big deal. It doesn't hurt you and doesn't pinch you, and you can make things work. You can continue to hit your own financial goals. For our own purposes, that wasn't the case. So we needed to continue to produce some income on the side while we got the business going. But more specifically, the question here is, do you need to go maybe into a lot of debt or immediately come up with financing options? Let's say sell some shares of the business as a way to get this off the ground. What I would recommend and caution and encourage you to do is, if at all possible, start as small as possible in your business pursuits. Because one, if you haven't been an entrepreneur before, you don't even know if you want to be an entrepreneur. Like, this is just a fun idea. And you haven't, maybe being like a fighter pilot, like you think that's awesome until maybe you get into the plane and either are going to love it or you're going to hate it. And truthfully, you're just not going to know until you get going down this pathway. And so any concern or risk that you might have with financing and getting outside sources to make this happen is you don't know if you're going to really like this. So start small, make the commitment small. If you could start it with a card table in your house, that's what Dave Ramsey said his whole company started with. I think that's actually true for him. Start as small as possible. Now, there are some business ventureships that's just not going to happen or be feasible. But what we want to accomplish here really is a proof of concept. This notion that this is going to work, that you like being an entrepreneur, that you've got some business savviness. Now, you don't have to have it all figured out for sure. You're going to learn a lot along the way, but you have at least some business savviness. You enjoy the risk. You enjoy some of the volatility that comes with entrepreneurship. It has its ups and downs, good days and its bad days. And only, you've got a product or service that you're providing to the marketplace that other people are interested in and are willing to pay you money for. Like all that needs to be proven and demonstrated really before you get too far along. Because once you introduce more money into the situation, you increase the risk, you increase the stress, you increase the need for this to be successful in order for you not to blow things up. And that adds stress. Ultimately, getting other money into the situation, whether it's through the assistance of a partner in terms of their contributions or just investors in terms of their commitment of capital to your venture. Nonetheless, all this introduces further stress. And I think pursuing an entrepreneurial activity in itself initially is stressful enough. Let's not add to that stress until we're ready for it. So there's a point where we need to mature and grow before we make that decision. There are some ventures in which, quite frankly, I just don't think having a small trial is going to be a feasible solution. You kind of need to come out of the gate fully running. So let's talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, what are your thoughts? Is starting small really the right way to go?
As you suggested, depending on what your product or your service or your offering is, that might change this demonstration a bit. But in our case, starting out small was very necessary and needed. And our own experience too, we had gotten to a point where we had invested personal equity, like our own blood, sweat, and tears, if you will, and invested a certain amount of capital into the business. And I don't remember at what point we had got to this point, Ben, but I remember you saying once, we're not investing any more of our personal money into this. Like the business needs to be at a point where it can pay us instead of us paying it. It's got this life of its own. But it was at a point where we couldn't put any more of our own money into it because you got to determine if you're in a losing draw or not. And so,
yeah, to bring that point home a little bit, the reason why you have to save and set some money aside is unless you from day one have folks signing up for your services and you're closing sales, you're going to have operational costs, not including your own time, but just, subscriptions and software and any number of things that need to be paid. And, you're coming out of your own pocket with the money that you set aside to cover those costs. And it may take a while before the other sales, the business starts generating enough revenue to even cover those costs. So, I think in our first year in the business, it was a good 12 months for us, maybe 18 months actually, before we were fully covering all of our monthly operation costs. It's such a funny thing because as the business grows, you tend to find other things in which you should be putting and spending money on. I think rightfully so as a way to develop the business. Part of the reason why it takes so long for a business to ever pay you is that even when you are starting small and you have relatively low expenses, as money comes into the door and you're able to cover those initial expenses, you start to come up with new expenses of like, oh gosh, it would be nice to have this thing or that thing, or maybe to start offer this. The stuff comes up. And so it takes a while before you get to a point where the business has fleshed itself out, really. I think we have a really good product or service where it's at now, and we don't need to come up with new expenses. And you have additional revenue, but there's more in those expenses, and you can start to take some of that money home. So that was certainly the case for us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note, again, I think starting small. And when you do start small, you will begin to start with smaller investments on your own with your personal capital for what kind of softwares and different programs or capabilities that you need, your different subscriptions. But as Ben said, the further you get along, well, that would really be nice to integrate. But starting with essentially like a bare bones concept as you're investing your own self, again, blood, sweat, tears, personal capital into this venture, the smaller you start, the easier it will be then to grow. I would advise, and Ben as a financial advisor would hopefully encourage and agree with this, that I would not advise having, an overhead of $500, $1,000 a month in your expenses with various subscriptions or platforms or what have you, if you don't have that income generated and you don't have additional spousal support from their income to make sure that this can happen flawlessly. Because then you're just going to dig yourself into a hole, which will then lead to more of a scarcity mindset, which will then lead into, may I say, desperation when it comes to promoting, supporting, advancing, trying to sell your product or your service. And that can come off and not the way that you want it to when you're trying to gather clients or prospective investors in what it is that you're offering.
I think I mostly agree with that. There are, depending on the business. I mean, so we just need to get into some specific businesses that you might just out of the gate have overhead of $1,000 a month. I think how I would want to nuance what Deb had just said is start with just what you need, essentials. You may be inclined to think that in order for this business to really go, I have to offer everything at this very moment, and I need to have the whole shebang. And I would caution you strongly against that. Perhaps in your business, maybe that is a necessity. I think it would depend on what you're trying to get off the ground. But I would caution you to do anything more than just the basic essentials. Going back to that notion again of proof of concept, like we need to prove this first and, give this a shot. Because, having been an entrepreneur for nearly a decade now, you all have a lot of ideas and a lot of suggestions and a lot of inclinations as to what you think the right thing to do is. And you really don't know until you try. It's very much a process of trial and error. And it's not until you try that you start to know what is working and what doesn't work, what you like, what you don't like. And so we want to actually maximize your flexibility. And the more we have added overhead and commitments, let's say lease obligations to your situation, the less flexible you are and the more you're really committed to a very specific plan of action that needs to unfold in order for this to be successful. And it's when you have this rigidity in the early years that, this is very much a gamble. We're not able to adjust if things aren't going the right way. So start small. That would be our recommendation. But you might, let's say, have a restaurant that you'd like to get up and running, some sort of food venture. But your initial inclination is, well, I got to go find a nice place and it's location, location, location. Let's go and find the best place we can in town. And restaurants are capitally intensive and we got to have staff right away. I can't do everything all at once. I can't be the cook and the waiter and the host and everything that comes into running a restaurant business. And so you think, I have to, like, if I'm going to start my own restaurant, then, we're going to have to get money, all this together. And, if we don't, it just isn't going to happen. And quite frankly, that may exactly be what you have to do depending on the type of restaurant. But as an alternative scenario, I would want to suggest to you is, well, rather than starting with a restaurant, let's just start with a food truck. Or even before we start with a food truck, let's just make some of the food that you plan to sell, give it to some friends and family. We call this market research, and just see if they even like it, right? I mean, you might love your food and just think it's amazing. Well, you can't make a business off of your own revenue, right? I mean, you might love what you make. Does anyone else love it? Does anyone else think it's that great? Is anyone else willing to pay money for this? Find out. Find out if other people are willing to get behind you. So make some food, have people over for dinner, get some affirmation that, hey, you're a great cook. Maybe you should start a business in this example. Find out first in that regard. And then the next step isn't, okay, I need to open a restaurant. There's a lot of expenditure, a lot of overhead with that, a huge commitment. We don't know if that's going to work. Let's start with the food truck. I don't know, let's do Saturday market fairs or just whatever smaller next step there is to take this further along. That's what I would encourage you to do. Start to get a name, a reputation, even a brand for yourself. Get a following. And so we actually have a great story here locally, not far from our home.
Which is really dangerous, I might add.
Yeah, we won't give you all the details of this, but someone really did just this thing. They had they started off making some food and ultimately created a food truck and then had a very successful food truck and a great following, and then used that as a springboard to starting their own business.
A brick and mortar restaurant. And they opened this brick and mortar restaurant right before the pandemic hit, and it was overflowing all the time. And then once the pandemic hit, they just shifted and adapted and did online orders only and have just been incredibly successful since then. And we drive by this every day. It's on our way out from our little neighborhood to the outlet of the main roads. And it's just beautiful to see the following that they created. They did their market research. They knew that they had something good that was going to be scalable. a bigger venture and made good on it.
Right. They had a following and momentum already built up behind them before they took on this commitment of debt and other. I don't know the details of their operation. I presume that they ultimately got a loan to make the restaurant happen, but they could take that loan in confidence that, look, we have a lot going in our favor already. This isn't just an idea that we cooked up. We've got a long history of success behind us. And now making that step into financing can be a logical and the correct step. To go back to my point previously of not all businesses operate that way. Like I'm thinking of a dental practice as an example. You can't go and put a chair in your living room and say, here, we'll clean your teeth or fix your cavity or something. We'll try to start this small. For a whole host of reasons, that's obviously not going to work. So there are going to be businesses where the next step into becoming a business owner is the full show. Like you can't start this in a smaller capacity. But I mean, I would even suggest perhaps in a dental practice, even if you have to start off fully running, it doesn't mean you necessarily need the biggest and the nicest and the best dental practice above everyone else. You can just find some little, strip mall that has some place. And there is a place there even to start small is my point. So in all of this, I think starting small is critical. But let's say you have moved along and now we have some success and we have good reason actually to think that finding some outside capital is going to be of benefit. What's the thinking that goes into that? When you use debt to fund your business, you're doing it because it's really like a steroid shot. You've already got something that's going, you're healthy, and we have good reason to think that this is going to lead to improvement. That steroid shot is going to be a catalyst to accelerate things along. Because what can happen is only if your decision making hasn't seasoned or matured, and now we have the steroid shot or this infusion of capital, you could very quickly blow that money away and find out that we spent a whole bunch of money and it didn't generate or come to any new business. What are we going to do? Because it was supposed we spent the money in hopes of growing and generating new business. We spent a whole bunch of money and it doesn't come to new business. Now we're in the same position we were previously, except we owe a lot more money than we had previously. So, debt or the contributions of other investors, that's an alternative scenario. Whether it's being financed out through a bank who's lending the money, or we have found other investors who are putting money into your business in exchange for some ownership in that business. Either way can work perfectly fine, but we need to know where this money is going to go, and we have some good ideas about how we're going to put it to use. And so the critical piece that I'm working my way towards here, especially if you're going to get a loan, but even I think other investors, you have to have a business plan. Like it's fine that you've gotten things up to this point. Maybe you've got it to the point of a food truck and you've been able to manage this well enough on your own. If you're going to take this leap into a much larger commitment of capital, no one is going to move forward then without you starting to clearly define what it is that you're going to do and how it's going to succeed. And that's a whole funny arrangement because very rarely do plans actually work or play out the way we thought they were. We almost always need to adjust. Deeply inside of me, even though I'm only a planner and people hire me to do financial plans, I can tell you from practical experience, rarely have I ever actually seen a plan fully play out the way we initially thought it was going to play out. So I just know that these business plans to a certain extent are just a joke, right? They're a joke because it's not going to happen the way we think it's going to happen. But it demonstrates to either your investors or to the bank, whoever's providing you some money to move your business along, it demonstrates really a focus, a commitment on your part. You're thinking ahead, you're thinking these things through. And, this isn't just an idea. These business plans could be dozens of pages, if not hundreds of pages long. And that's the critical piece here as we start to piece together, what is this money doing for us? Well, that's what that business plan is going to tell you.
I'd like to touch upon, Ben, you brought up building a following, and making yourself known with the example of the restaurant here locally that we frequent maybe more often than what we should, which is why it's so dangerous that we live as close as we do. This makes me think about my own mentor in this business mentorship space. And she had built up a bit of a following with the purchase of this download and started building up an email list, not knowing exactly what she was going to do with it, but then realized in this particular sphere of influence that she had a lot of clout, a lot of experience in kind of business coaching and mentoring people into the next step for moving forward in their business. And because she had built this relationship with her downloadable purchase item, she wanted to expand upon that and quit the job that she was working at and offer this service of guiding women in this sphere. And so, in a very real way, she didn't necessarily have a business plan, but knowing that this is what she wanted to venture into, she, based on those built up relationships with her following, she asked a number of people to invest in her, going through additional training, coaching, entrepreneurship, essentially, so that she could guide them in this down the road. And so she got those initial investors who bought into her idea, even though she didn't even know exactly what that was going to be yet. And she offered them privileges in this realm for life for as long as she held that tenet of the business. And so that's one way to continue to nurture your following and kind of build up that tribe. If depending on what service or offering or profession that you're in, that could be an option for you as a capital investors, not necessarily, big money investors, but people that really want your services and could offer that feedback to you in your market research.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would be hesitant to call or think of that as a capital or an investor, but it is before you go into all the work of creating a product that you hope others will buy into. Let's actually get them to buy it first before you've created it. First, find out if there's interest in the marketplace and then sell it. That's not a bad approach or idea. Let's make the product after we know people are going to buy into it, which is certainly the example or the case that Deb was alluding to. I want to pull back over into this issue of financing. So we have a question of which way should you do this? You have principally two ways. In the capital markets, we think of this as stocks or bonds. In a small business activity, it's still fundamentally the same thing. It's, do we use a bank and get a loan from them? That's your bond. Or do we ultimately get capital from other investors? That would be your stock comparatively. I would advocate strongly that we would try to do this through a bank if you're looking to get more money into the business to help it grow. Why would I do that? Well, one is the bank doesn't become a co-owner, right? Or you really have a co-owner. There are good reasons to have investors or partners in your business activity. I certainly wouldn't want to discourage that altogether. In fact, we've had some experience in those domains. They can be, to your benefit. But you have a co-owner, right? If you go down that pathway versus the bank or, some other investor who's just simply lending you the money. We have a loan of some sort. That arrangement is much more flexible because the amount of say the other person has in your daily operations is lessened. They're not going to be part of your management meetings. So I would advocate for working with a bank in the early years, if at all possible. But fundamentally, banks, especially if the operation is something that has to be fully up to snuff in short order and hit the ground running right away, banks tend to only want to lend so much money as a way to manage their own risk. And so publicly traded companies, an example, can't fund their operations by working with banks because no one single bank wants to take on that risk. And so as a way to diversify or dilute that risk, alternatively, you could use investors. You could establish a corporation. And one of the benefits of why you would use a corporation is that it, just structurally speaking, allows for people to fundamentally become co-owners in the business, but only be risking at most their capital. They don't become necessarily liable for management decisions or the failure of the corporation. If the corporation itself does something that's wrong to other people or to the public, that doesn't boomerang back onto the shareholders. So there are reasons ultimately to go and get those investors. One of the main reasons actually is it's a means by which you can raise a lot of capital spread out across a very large audience and diversify that risk where maybe you get a few people giving you $1,000 or even 10,000 or 100. Usually companies start out as privately held, not publicly traded. Publicly traded companies have to go through a lot more registration with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, in order to use the broad markets, the public audience. So all of this isn't something that's probably as realistic to move into. Now, there could be folks, perhaps who are listening to this, who have a solution that in the marketplace that needs to happen today in order for it to be of any value. The need for the solution may be going away in relatively short order, or their operation is just simply capitally intensive. And so it would be in that circumstance in which you would consider incorporating and finding outside investors to basically, let's get this as big and large as possible. And that's not something that I can say I really have a lot of experience in. Certainly I don't think anyone who was looking for that would want to seek me out as an advisor. I couldn't direct you very well because it's a very specialized means of running a business. I think what I would want to leave you with as we bring this episode to a close is that even though that's kind of what's typically depicted, you think of a startup company as an example that this is what you need to do. We have to get outside investors to get this thing going. That's only particularly needed for a very niche type of entrepreneur. Most entrepreneurship activities can get underway by just some seed capital, some of your own self-funding, and starting small and just seeing how this grows and develops. If needed, we'll get a bank involved and get an operating loan to cover costs as we expand. Maybe we might need a very distinctive business plan. If your field kind of requires that, going back to the dentist, then, so be it. There's really no way getting around this. You probably are absolutely going to have to take a loan out to become an owner of that business. But you've also committed, as a dentist, you've committed years of training to what you're doing. The market is pretty established and known. The need for dentistry isn't something that's going away anytime soon, and it's not easily replaceable. Like, even though there is a risk that's being taken in the acquisition of that loan, it's a fairly safe risk because the business itself is a pretty defined business. I think the less definition we have in any of these sort of things, the more there is need for us to stay small or to minimize just how many people we get involved in the early years. One thing that we haven't talked about, we're just going to have to kick it off into the next meeting, is what about having a partner rather than investors, having someone else to go that you would go into business with. That really is an interesting idea. And we thought we were going to talk about it in today's show. I think we're just going to hold off on it for another episode. But what about the possibility of a partner, taking on a partner as a way to get a business going? Well, I suppose let's just stay tuned at the FI Entrepreneur as we talk about that in a future show. But thanks for taking the time to listen. We'll be in touch.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. I hope you've had as much fun as we did. If you'd like to learn more about any of the subjects we spoke about, please visit our website for show notes, links, and more. Hit like, subscribe, or whatever button you've got in front of you to show some love. Remember, the information presented in this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Remember what Teddy Roosevelt said about the person who strives greatly. If he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Until next time, keep striving.
Thanks again, and be well.